Much better. Well, I'm David Levy. Just a brief introduction. I grew up in a fairly secular home, became fairly religious in my mid-20s until somewhere in my 30s I opted out of the whole business. So I had some notes that I put on my iPad. There we go. Thank you, Jessica, for the awesome graphic. So, question I get most is, who is a Jew? What makes you a Jew? And it's pretty simple. You're born to a Jewish mother, or you go through the formal conversion process. Conversion is discouraged for a number of reasons. For the most part, even though you hear a lot about chosen people, Gentiles are not worse or better than Jews. It just, they have less responsibilities. They're only, actually, according to Orthodox Jews, they're only responsible for the 7 Noahide laws, which I have here. These come from Genesis, of course. Of course, 2 of them have to do with God's jealousy, right? You're not supposed to pray to anybody else. You're not supposed to blaspheme, right? So, really, what are Jews? And the best definition, is it a race, is it a religion? Really, it's an extended family, so to speak. So really, we're sort of the extended family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob from the Bible. There are, so how do we sort of fit into the Jewish community? There are 2 main types, Ashkenazic and Sephardic. Ashkenazic are what most people know as Jews here in the United States. They're mostly Eastern European origin. So Poland, Russia, Germany, Eastern Europe. Then there's the Sephardic, which are from North Africa, Spain, and the Middle East. Very similar. They do pronounce some of the Hebrew letters a little bit different. One letter, the Tav. Ashkenazics pronounce it as a S, Sav, and Sephardic pronounces it as a Tav. In modern Hebrew in Israel, they use the Sephardic pronunciation, so it's a Tav. The different movements within Judaism, of course, most people that you'll meet are Reform. There's no ED on the end of that. It's actually Reform Judaism. And that really kind of sprang out of Germany as a result of anti-Semitism. They really tried to blend in. And if you go to a Reform synagogue, it looks very much like a church. An Orthodox synagogue looks very different. You'll have the pulpit sort of in the middle and everybody surrounding it. And if you go to a Reform synagogue or a conservative synagogue, really you'll have the pulpit up high and the parishioners, if you will, facing the rabbi. There's also the conservative movement. That's a little bit more religious. And they range from being very non-traditional to being very traditional. And sprung out of the conservative movement is the Reconstructionist movement. They actually don't believe in a supernatural God at all, but at the same time, they're more observant than the conservative movement. Which is a very interesting concept. A little bit more religious than that are the modern Orthodox. Joe Lieberman is a good example of modern Orthodox Jew, and they look pretty much, they dress pretty much like everybody else. They just, sometimes they'll wear their yarmulke, their little hat, all the time. Joe Lieberman doesn't, but most modern Orthodox Jews, they'll have their yarmulke on all the time. Then you get to the ultra-Orthodox, or as I call them, the cults. These are the ones that have very cult-like behaviors. They dress the same. Doesn't matter what the weather is like. You'll see them in Israel where it's 98 degrees outside. They'll have a black suit on, a wool coat, and a giant mink hat on. And it's 98 degrees outside. Okay, obviously this isn't traditional from the area. This is traditional from Eastern Europe where it's really freaking cold. And they all dress the same, and the communities are actually really small. Here in Houston, if you go around where the Jewish community is, there's about 10 different ultra-Orthodox synagogues, and they all have different traditions. And you'll see some of them here, not so much. If you think of the ultra-Orthodox with the long sideburns, they're called payas, and they don't cut those. Those are from birth. And they don't do that because there's a verse in the Bible that says you shall not trim the corners of your face. So they call that the corners. So what do we all share in common? It's the Jewish Bible. The Jewish Bible is called the Tanakh, which is an acronym for Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. These are the books of the Tanakh listed for you. So the Torah is the first 5 books, the Nevi'im and the Ketuvim, which are the prophets and then the writings. The Torah is the most revered text, and it's actually chanted out loud every Saturday morning, which is the Sabbath. And it's in a scroll. And to give you an example of how difficult it is for somebody to read the Torah, read from the Torah, can you figure out what this says? What's it missing? It's missing God. There you go. Extraordinary claims. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And that's what it's like reading from the Torah. Now, when you study for reading the Torah, you have something like this top line. And on the top of the letters are the trope symbols. These are the cues for how to chant it, how to sing it. And every tradition has their own tropes. So it's very interesting in the U.S. because you have different communities coming together, so you get to hear different trope styles and different songs. And this was traditionally how the Torah was passed down before it was really written down. And, back then everybody was pretty illiterate, so you just learned it and sang it, and you sang your portion every year. Now on the bottom, that's what it looks like in the Torah. There's no vowels, there's no trope symbols. So they literally have to practice. We're going to have to skip that because the link didn't work. So now, what do people associate with Jews is some of the dietary restrictions. They're really kind of simple, but Jews spend, especially Orthodox Jews, spend an inordinate amount of time trying to be in compliance with these rules. And the basic rules are here. Animals must be slaughtered and butchered under rabbinic supervision, subject to inspections. There's no prayer said over it. It's not like there's a special incantation. It's about how the animal is slaughtered, how it's butchered, and in general, you're just not allowed to ingest any blood. So after the animal is butchered, it's hung upside down to let the blood drain into the ground. Then they salt the meat, wash the salt off, salt the meat again, wash the salt the meat again. So Jewish kosher meat is very salty, just in general. So kosher mammals that are allowed to be slaughtered have to have two signs. They have to chew their cud, and they have to have a split hoof. That's the reason pigs aren't kosher. It's not that they're dirty animals. It's they don't chew their cud. They have a split hoof, but they don't chew the cud. Same with a horse. Horses, they don't have a split hoof. They chew their cud, but they don't have a split hoof. So horses are not kosher. But most mammals, cows, lamb, it's all kosher as long as it's slaughtered correctly. Any vegetable is kosher, period. End of story. If it's vegetarian, it's kosher. Unless it's dairy, then it becomes a little bit iffy. Because of the processing of dairy is where it gets complicated. And the big thing that you have to avoid is the mixing of meat and dairy. They have to be kept separate under all circumstances. And that goes as far as if you're having a meat meal, you cannot have cream in your coffee. You cannot have a side that's got a little butter on it. Not allowed. Complete separation. And they go as far as to even have separate dishes, separate pots and pans, separate silverware, and some of the very wealthy families, they have two kitchens. And so if you ever want to look at it, if you go to Fondren Southwest, which is where a lot of Orthodox Jews live, they'll have 2 kitchens in those houses. And they'll literally lock the door. I'm going to take questions at the end.
I was just going to say, so a Reuben is an abomination.
Absolutely. Fish must have 2 signs, again, fins and scales. That's why shellfish are not allowed. Catfish, also not allowed because it doesn't have scales. Let's see. I think I hit everything up there. So, holidays. Forgot about this part. Oh, well. So, with processed food, it becomes difficult to decide what's kosher. If you look on any product, you might see one of these symbols, and actually some of the products we have in the back have kosher symbols on them, and if you look really hard, you can find them. So, I brought a few. I figured I'd pass it around so that way you can see where some of them are. And Orthodox Jews, they will study these packages and find that symbol. And depending on their sect, some of them they will accept, some of them they will not. If they don't know the rabbi who did that inspection, that's not good enough for them.
So it's like gang cats.
It kind of is. And there are certain, the most accepted is the OU, which is the second one from the top, and then the one right next to that, which is Circle K. Those are pretty much universally accepted. Those are the largest kosher supervision authorities in the country. All right, well, I'm running really well. So also, there's no, going back to fish, there's no rules for slaughtering fish. And you get, there are 3 categories. I thought I had 3 categories. Yeah. So when we talk about dairy not coming into contact with meat, you have 3 categories of food. You have meat, dairy, and then neutral. So meat, fairly self-explanatory, but that also includes chicken. Does not include fish. Dairy is anything with milk as part of it. So cheese, creamer, that kind of thing. Neutral is vegetables, and oddly enough, eggs. Eggs are neutral, chicken is meat. Fish is neutral. And they call that parv. So you'll see the symbol, and sometimes next to it you'll see a small D. That means it's kosher dairy. You'll see the symbol with the word parv next to it, P-A-R-V-E, and that means it's neutral, which means you can use it in both meat and dairy dishes. So the thing that confuses most people about Jewish holidays is they seem to travel around the year. You never know when they're going to happen. The reason that is because it's on a lunar calendar, not the accurate calendar. So what this means is that every so often they have to, because the moon cycles aren't exactly a month, the holidays will travel throughout the year. They'll get later and later and later. And so what they do is every so often they throw in a leap month.
Yes.
They do one of the months twice. So that way they can bring the holiday back to the right time of year. Jewish holidays are very tied to the season. Ancient Israelites were farmers, so most of the holidays have to do with bringing in the harvest. Actually, right now, it's the holiday of Sukkot, which you'll see people, not necessarily here, but in nicer climates, they'll build a little booth, a small booth in their backyard, and they'll eat dinner out there every night, and they'll hang out, because the commandment is to dwell in your sukkah. And that goes back to when they build these booths out in the field, and they'd sleep in them, and they'd bring the harvest in during the day, and then go back to their booth at night. Jewish days always begin at night. Does anybody have an idea as to why that is?
The day starts at sundown. The moon cycle.
Actually, it's because of Genesis.
The band?
First there was night, then there was day. First there was night, then there was light, a first day. So because of that, all Jewish days begin at sundown. So the Sabbath, for example, always begins the night before. So Friday night to Saturday night. Now, the Sabbath. Thank you. You're welcome for the Sabbath. That was a Jewish invention. I don't know exactly when Christians moved the Sabbath from the last day to the first day of the week, but the Sabbath is the other part that, especially very observant Jews, struggle with and really work hard. It's also the holiest day in the Jewish year. Does anybody know why that is? Yeah.
It's the holiest day because that's when God rests. Because he was finished making.
That's a good answer, but the actual truth is because it's the only one in the Ten Commandments. So that is the only holiday that is specifically commanded in the Ten Commandments, the Big Ten. So the Sabbath is super holy, and people that are very observant, they're called Shomer Shabbos, which means guarding the Sabbath in Hebrew. And they will refrain from doing anything regarded as work. These are the 39 categories of work that you are prohibited from doing on the Sabbath. Well, I will tell you, there's a reason why Jews make very good lawyers. It is not about the spirit of the law. It's not about what you actually believe. It's about what you do. And if you're in compliance with the literal law, you're good. So, for example, as long as you can't use an elevator, right? You can't push buttons in an elevator. But in Israel, people live in skyscrapers. So how do they get around that? The elevator has what's called Shabbat mode. Whereas you get in, and it just goes and it stops and opens the door on every floor. You're also not allowed to flip a light switch. Well, if you flip a light switch, there's a small spark. And that is burning. So they put things on timers. As long as you set up your timers, there's no problem. So they're big sports fans. They want to watch the games on Saturday or a favorite television show. They set their timer, turn their TV on at a certain time, then it pops on and there you go. They're just not allowed to do it. They're not allowed to cook or cut. So how do you prepare meals? You plan ahead, you stick it in a crock pot, and you leave it on. And so you just go and you get yourself something out of the crock pot. That's how they eat. You are allowed to carry in your home. So, yeah, and this gets to the magic string, right? So how do people, especially in this day and age, get to synagogue? They have to walk, they can't drive, but they're prohibited from carrying.
What if I have a baby?
This is how they get around it. What they do is they look at the lines, the power lines, around a certain community, and they define that as the home. So you are allowed to carry your keys in the home. I think that pretty much covers everything. I'm open to questions now.
When Winnowing, the last entrance? Yeah, no, side.
Anybody got gluten?
De-seeding wheat.
It's where you drop,
Yeah.
it's how you separate the chaff from the wheat. Let it pass the filter, and the wind will take the chaff away.
Yes, sir.
Who came up with all these rules? Is there a committee, or is there a Jewish pope, or what it was?
That's a very good question. In the ultra-Orthodox community, it comes back to their particular Rebbe. So they have one Rebbe, but mostly it's, have you heard of the book, the Talmud? The Talmud is essentially it's like the minutes of a Supreme Court hearing. It's a bunch of rabbis that sat around and says, well, here's the line. So they'll set it up. The way the Talmud is set up, you'll have the line from the Torah in the center, and on the top, around the edges, you'll have the commentary from one book, and then underneath you'll have commentary from another book. And it's basically Rabbi A says this, Rabbi B says this.
I have a similar question about the calendar, but it's more coordinated. How, I guess, I assume that, yeah, when does this leap month happen and who agrees on it?
You know, I forgot to look up how often they do that leap month, but it is consistent, and you know, it's based on the lunar cycle, you know, from new moon to new moon.
Okay.
Let's see, Dennis?
The Amish get around the transportation issue if they have to go to a hospital or something by having the English, the people who are non-Amish, drive them, which seems a little bit funny to me. So do Jews on the Sabbath eat at restaurants? Someone else is cooking the food and that makes it okay? Or
Well, yes, they have, in the synagogues, they have what's called a Shabbos Goy. That's a Gentile who works for the synagogue on Saturday. And so they can turn the lights on and unlock all the doors and make the coffee and cut the bacon, you know, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, they have the Shabbos Goy. No. Yeah.
I was just wondering about, you said you can't have dairy with it. What about non-dairy creamers?
Yes, it is. And actually, you have kosher Jews to thank for non-dairy creamer. Mocha Mate, I think, is the original. And you have to be careful. If you look at most non-dairy creamers, if you look at the kosher symbol, it'll say OUD. So there is some dairy in there.
On the first slide, you had something about conversion. You said it's painful for males. I don't want to make any assumptions about anything. What does that mean?
That means even if you had a circumcision at birth, you're getting another one.
Oh.
It's not a full circumcision, it's more of, and you have to be awake at the time.
Oh.
They don't put you under, but they you know, it depends how serious they are, they just draw a little blood.
Wow.
So they poke it with a needle and draw a little blood. So,
Kosher dill pickles. If all vegetables are already kosher, what makes a pickle kosher or not kosher?
the process. That's it. All pickles, if you do it yourself, they're kosher, they're vegetables.
I was just wondering why they advertise that, right? Kosher dill pickles.
Flavor.
How could it not be kosher? Yeah, how could it not be kosher?
That's a really good question. All pickles are kosher. I mean, it might be that they're a little saltier.
They might use dairy-derived probiotics.
Oh, that makes sense.
Right. Yes.
So I want to tease out where you stand in this. You mentioned you had a secular youth, and then you were religious for a while, and now you're not. Do you consider yourself a Jew now that you're not, whatever that means?
You are a Jew.
Yes. I was born to a Jewish mother. I will always be a Jew. So I am an atheist agnostic Jew.
I read an article about kosher as an industry. In other words, the whole business. I mean, you pay money if you've got a product and you want it to be endorsed. And there's a lot of non-Jews that also look for the kosher symbol. And so and maybe that's why there's so many different kosher symbols, is because it's basically an industry worldwide, to get your product marked as kosher.
Yeah, it's essentially a little hidden tax.
Eventually, one more question.
Okay. All right, how about way in the back?
What's meant by an Arab line?
I'm sorry?
I've heard the term Arab line.
I'm not familiar with that. I'm
I
sorry.
wonder if it's like the telephone pole thing.
Oh, okay, that's what I was talking about. Sometimes if the telephone lines don't complete, sometimes you'll see people, they'll put a piece of string.
Yeah.
You'll see it a lot in Miami. You'll see a piece of string and it might get cut. So every Friday, the rabbi has to go out and inspect it to make sure that string is complete. Otherwise, it's not a home. Then everybody is sinning.
Thank you.